The election of 2008 may prove to be a defining moment in the history of American democracy. A young senator and relative upstart with a community organizing background on the streets of Chicago won an impressive victory, and his campaign revalued the role that organizing can play in American politics, even as it melded old-fashioned face-to-face methods with online social networking tools. Candidate Barack Obama repeatedly stressed themes that change must come from the bottom up, with, quotes, all hands on deck to solve problems and citizens working across many of the divisions in our society. To signal a major step forward in our development as a democracy, President Obama issued a presidential memorandum on transparency and open government on his first full day in office. The first principle, government should be transparent, is the most familiar, and press commentary generally stopped there. Transparency is a precondition for accountability. As long as we citizens can hold them or our elected and appointed officials accountable, as long as we can know what they are doing, we can hold them to account and get rid of them if need be. But transparency also enhances the effective utilization of knowledge. The memorandum continued. It does not just bring government into the sunlight, it helps make knowledge productive in the broadest public sense. The second principle of the memorandum, government should be participatory, builds explicitly upon one of the most important insights of information age governance theory. Knowledge and information are so widely dispersed in society that government cannot be fully effective unless it finds innovative ways of utilizing citizens' own, quotes, collective expertise. The more complex our problems and systems, the less can government experts dispense with forms of knowledge generated within communities and across civic networks. The third principle, government should be collaborative, aims to engage citizens in the work of their government, not just in mobilizing the grassroots for favored policies and waiting for implementation by bureaucrats, regulators, or contractors, but also in doing everyday civic work, everyday democracy, that directly builds communities, restores ecosystems, improves public health, makes homes and workplaces energy efficient. Thus, the President charged executive departments and agencies to, quote, use innovative tools, methods, and systems to enable productive collaboration across agencies and levels of government, as well as among everyday citizens, nonprofits, business stakeholders, and other institutional actors. The Obama administration has begun to put in place a variety of initiatives intended to enhance civic engagement in the years to come, and some of these have been mentioned. The Edward Kennedy and Kennedy Serve America Act, designed to expand AmeriCorps from 75,000 to 250,000 members over 5 years, with designated corps in areas like health and clean energy. It's established various White House offices. I, like some of you, are still probably trying to figure out what they're all doing together, but we'll talk about that a little bit. And people in various agencies, and as Carolyne will certainly talk about, and Martha as well probably, senior officials in agencies have felt authorized, if you will, to begin to take these principles forward within the management and programming design, et cetera, within agencies. So there's a lot of possibility there. Might these and related initiatives signal the beginning of a new age of democracy in American history, something akin to the age of Jefferson or the age of Jackson, or even the participatory democratic movements and reforms of the Progressive era or the 1960s? The simple answer to this question is hopefully, potentially, but by no means certainly. Thus not a very simple answer after all. What we know from prior ages of democratic innovation is that hope and vision and a belief in civic agency and citizens as agents of our history can inculcate new public norms, develop new civic organizing forms, generate innovative governance practices and institutions. As Arthur Schlesinger Jr. wrote in his classic The Age of Jackson, the Jacksonians could mobilize a, quote, great common vision that inspired hope by drawing upon the rhetorical resources of the Jeffersonian myth. What we also know about democratic change, however, is that the obstacles are great, the paradoxes of new practices plentiful, and the possibilities of succumbing to unworkable democratic myths are ever present. Brown University political scientist Jim Morone argues in the book, about almost 20 years old now, The Democratic Wish, his study of prior episodes of reform in American history. Democratic myths have often resulted in stronger bureaucracies and less participation, and capacities for overall governance in core areas of policy have fallen seriously short as a result. Thus, thinking about democracy in the age of Obama is tricky business, but all the more necessary in view of potential obstacles, misleading detours, and unworkable myths. But we do not have to repeat history in the sense of falling prey to unworkable myths, nor do we have to wait for history to pass before we sketch some potential outlines and pitfalls to enable us to become more effective actors on the historical stage of democracy today. What I want to do today is argue that collaborative governance with engaged citizens needs to be a central part of any reform agenda in the age of Obama. If the age of Obama is to become an age of robust and sustainable democracy. I'm a great believer in pluralism, not just in the sense of core ideals of social and political pluralism, but also in the sense that citizens need a plural array of forms through which they engage in the public sphere. Electoral participation, public interest group lobbying, social movement mobilization, online organizing, community service, prophetic community organizing of the sort that informed the faith-based networks that Obama himself got his socialization in organizing through, such as Gamaliel, but also industrial areas, Foundation, PICO, etc. But a plural array should not be confused with a lazy configuration that sees all these forms as equally important or believes that coherence will emerge automatically. We need to think quite strategically about where we are and how to make the most important investments in democracy, both those investments coming from government and also those from nonprofits and civic sectors as well. And of course, this is the title of my recent book, Investing in Democracy. What I would like to do here is just give an overview of some core ideas of collaborative governance, tease out a few examples from some of the charts, begin to open up some questions, and then at the very end put up a little diagram of, I think, what some of the dynamics going forward are. And I'm not fixated on some rigid formula that all 8 components in this table have to be present. In fact, I would argue that what creative public problem solving, developing policies, administrative practices, et cetera, that support collaborative ways of problem solving at the grassroots generally pick and choose from a variety. Depending on the type of community, the type of public good, et cetera. But I lay out here, and in the second chapter of the book, 8 of these. Most of you are probably familiar with them. I'll just quickly say a few things about each for those who do not come from those particular traditions. The first one, and in some ways the central one, is that let me back up one second in the introduction. My concern here is primarily looking from the angle of what government can do, not necessarily what citizens do from the grassroots, although the two are clearly related. So I'm not throwing my net so widely as to talk about all forms of engagement. And so the 8 principles here of collaborative governance and policy design, in other words, those forms of principles of design of policy that can engage citizens productively in public life, if you will. I know that's a loaded term. First, co-produce public goods. That citizens are not just claimants, they're not just claimants for rights, it's not just about being part of the polity, it's not just about voting, it's not just about rights coming through policy as defining a client, etc., a protected class, whatever that the role of citizens really is, one core role, is as producers. In other words, citizens produce public life, citizens produce public goods. Those things which are genuinely public goods, public safety, public health, and many of the healthy ecosystems are things that citizens can and often do have a role in producing themselves, often, as we'll see, in partnership with delegated public officials, etc. But we often lose the idea that citizens themselves are producers. Secondly, and the first one, by the way, is quite pervasive now in a lot of policy planning and other kinds of analysis in terms of the term co-production. In fact, what's his name, Kundra in the White House, Vivek Kundra talks about co-creation, citizens as co-creators. He got that term from the movement, the civic renewal community building movement that's been going on in this country for the past 15 years, using terms like that very, very commonly. And Harry Boyd, who, by the way, sends his apologies, originally he was going to be on this panel as well, has talked about public work and co-production, sort of a core theme in the development of US social movements and civic engagement for more than a century. Secondly, a term quite familiar to people in the community building, community development field, but it's much broader, is assets-based community development. In other words, that robust communities as problem-solving systems come about partly because we look at them as spaces and community as actors that have assets that are not just deficits, bundles of deficits. I cannot stress enough that how, in some sense, I'll overstate this, but revolutionary, this simple thing that Jody Kretzmann, John McKnight, and others at the Assets-Based Community Development Institute began to tease out from their studies of local groups in the 1980s and then in the 1990s more formalized. In other words, when you look at a community, do you look at it from the lens of what it's missing and therefore what professional, policy, bureaucrats, etc., and regulators, not that all of those are bad things, by the way, need to bring to fill those deficits? Or do you first look at the community in terms of the range of assets, civic networks, public buildings, all kinds of other things that people in communities can begin to knit together in new ways so that they can become active problem-solving agents in their communities? The fields of community development, but also disability, many other areas have really benefited greatly by this perspective. Third, and I'll run through these, I got to run through these a little faster. Sharing professional expertise. Again, this framework basically says citizens have expertise, not just local knowledge, or sort of policy people have said for years, but citizens can actually generate really important core expert knowledge, including scientific knowledge about hazards in their community. One of my former undergraduate students at Brandeis, now professor of planning at Berkeley, Jason Coburn, wrote a wonderful book called Street Science, which is a study of Greenpoint, Williamsburg, where I was born and actually lived for a while in graduate school, which is a community that really, in some sense, established a kind of street science collaboration between experts in public bureaucracies, in medical schools, public health, but in local social networks, youth groups, etc., that together piece together the pieces of knowledge that were necessary to begin to transform very hazardous, environmentally unjust communities, to turn them around, to set them on a trajectory that was much more sustainable in terms of the community's health and also the community development. A fourth principle probably doesn't require a whole lot of elaboration, but because deliberative democracy has been such an important frame in political theory in the last 20 years or so, at least. Enable public policy should, not always, in the same way, of course, enable citizens themselves to deliberate about what might be good policy, etc., but also about important things such as trade-offs. In other words, how do we solve problems? How do we think of other people's interests that seem often at odds with our own interests? How do we therefore perhaps reconfigure interests into a larger, although by no means ever perfect, public interest or common interest? And thus have citizens take responsibility for that deliberation and also enhance the legitimacy and the possibilities of implementing public policy on the ground. Fifth, building into policy designs that enable, create incentives for citizens, stakeholder groups, etc., to build partnerships, to build relationships of trust, and where possible, sustainable partnerships, not only among like-minded people, but often people who are at odds with each other, who represent truly different kinds of configurations of interest and different take on things, sometimes very, very locked in battle, sometimes battling for a decade or more, and sometimes locked in battle that goes to the state Supreme Court or someplace else before finally moving off the dime. I'm not saying that is always possible. Nobody says that's always possible, even that it's possible in the majority of cases. But it's often possible, and communities often opt for it as a way of breaking policy log jams that exist in communities and enable communities to move forward in more productive fashion. The sixth principle, and I'll talk about this a little bit more when I give EPA as an example, policy should think about building fields strategically. So quickly, when we think that our watersheds have deteriorated over generations, even with the Clean Water Act of 1970, and even with lots of regulations, yes, deregulation, re-regulation, and all the battles that are around that, what has emerged in the past more than 20 years is a watershed movement that has several thousand watershed associations, watershed councils, etc., around the country. The question, however, remains, thinking strategically, is if you really want to improve the sustainability of ecosystems and protect and restore watersheds, what do you need across the field as a whole in terms of the major environmental agencies, state programs, local groups, intermediary groups that provide training and data analysis, etc.? This is a really complicated question. And those in the federal government, I would argue here, but you could make the same argument for at the state or local level, need to think of, well, what are all the range of components that might be needed? Regulatory, tools, etc., market tools in some cases, but what are particularly the range of civic and public components that somehow need to be knit together so that problem solving is enhanced, but also that citizens are increasingly empowered in the process. 7, quickly transform institutional cultures. And what this is really about is that, make this as a grand argument, all institutions, but certainly those institutions with a public purpose, profit, nonprofit, etc., need to think about the institutional culture that they have that either enables citizens to be empowered problem solvers or disables them. The culture of many organizations, including organizations that have a really good purpose and really do some very good things, is often of the form that is quite disabling in terms of citizens taking initiative, citizens collaborating across different boundaries, etc., citizens coming up with new solutions and the like. And that has a lot of different dimensions. We can talk about some examples of that. And finally, ensure reciprocal accountability. This is a sort of a bigger discussion, but that accountability is very much about all actors in any given institutional environment having some accountability, some joint accountability for problem solving. It is not just, as Robert Bean, the Kennedy School of Harvard says, there are those people we hold accountable and we do the sort of the accounting, the holders and the holdees. That when we function in such complex systems where all kinds of collaboration has to take place, we have to define a much more multi-sided and reciprocal array of accountability mechanisms. And that, of course, means those in power have to be held accountable. But it also means that citizen groups, leaders of civic organizations, et cetera, who basically, in some sense, say we will do X or we will deliberate fairly and inclusively, et cetera, rather than narrowly and self-interestedly, are also held accountable by the public systems that are put in place, and I can give some examples of that later. Let me do a couple, take about 5 more minutes. Is that it? Is that okay? About 5 minutes? Yeah. We won't get to everything, but one of the things I did in this study, I looked a couple of, there's a chapter, there's a very long, fairly long chapter on Seattle and its system of neighborhood association, but also neighborhood planning, climate action, other kinds of environmental planning that are sort of spinning out of that. Look at Hampton, Virginia, another city. But I take one federal agency, the US EPA, over its entire history, so from 1970 forward, when it was created by President Nixon, an executive order, and ask the question, here's an agency set up with a command and control regulatory model for very good reasons. In other words, unless we commanded and controlled and punished and forced, we weren't going to achieve some of the core goals of environmental protection coming out of the 70s, et cetera. Within a fairly short time, at least in some arenas, it became clear, and across the political spectrum, not just by conservative theorists, but regulatory thinkers across the board, not all of them, but certainly some very progressive regulatory thinkers, also came to the conclusion that if you're going to protect ecosystems as a whole, if you're going to protect people's health in communities of color in cities in Williamsburg, sort of command and control, silo by silo, medium by medium is not a very effective way to do that. And that we would need more community-based, holistic, integrative tools to be able to make progress. It doesn't mean you throw the other tools out. Okay, that's a thing I'm sure we'll come back to. So what I wanted to do is look at a federal agency that I had reason to believe from various work, previous work, had really tried to learn this lesson, and through a variety of its programmatic activities over now more than 4 decades, almost 5 decades, through Republican and Democratic administrations, had tried to figure out how do we work with communities in a way that communities themselves feel that we're getting the tools, the incentives, et cetera, to be able to make progress. And just quickly is two tables here. The first one, since I can't tell this story in 2 minutes, the first one, it gives you a sense of the range of tools that were developed in through the Office of Water, and particularly the Office of Wetlands, Oceans, and Watersheds, to enable communities to become much more empowered in protecting and restoring watersheds. What you see in this table, and again, I can't go through it all, is that the EPA, over a period, especially the last 2 decades, has really worked with communities to say, well, what are the tools that you think you need to protect and restore this watershed, to get the information that you think you need to make the proper decisions on how to protect the Puget Sound, or the Chesapeake Bay, etc. And the agency, working collaboratively, not only with local groups, but a variety of intermediaries, such as the River Network, a movement organization that has 700 organizational members out of Portland, Oregon, a national network, the Colorado Watershed Assembly, the Southeast Watershed Forums. In other words, these intermediary organizations who have basically adopted a watershed frame for protecting and restoring watersheds. What do you need? And what you see here is a very partial list. Data tools, management tools, planning tools, deliberative ways of having deliberative forums within a watershed, doing county watershed planning with citizens, technical tools that ordinary citizens and school groups and others can use. And again, it would take me a long time to go through these, but the thing here is that over time, responding to communities, again, through Republican and Democratic administrations, and I'm not saying they're equal or they developed in some big, smooth fashion, the agency figured out how to, in some sense, internalize community empowerment into the way it developed some of its tools and also aligned them with regulatory programs so that the regulatory programs weren't working at cross purposes with what it was that communities felt they needed to make progress in their watershed. And we could look at environmental justice from this angle, et cetera. And then just quickly, the second table on the EPA, without taking you through all the details. The watershed movement exists now recognizably as a quite vibrant movement. If you look at this table, what you will see is that the EPA not only responded to the movement, in other words, didn't just say, citizens, challenge us and we will give you what you want. It said, let's work together to figure out how to build the watershed movement as a network of civic activists and other stakeholders. And they convened conferences, forums, policy institutes in all areas of watershed work, estuaries, urban rivers, trashed rivers conferences, et cetera, et cetera. If you look over a 20-year period, what you see, and I don't want to overstate it, but I do think it's worth stating it boldly, the EPA helped build the watershed movement. The EPA, a federal agency, through Republican and Democratic administrations, built one of the most important movements for protecting ecosystems in the United States, and that wasn't an accident. It's partly not because they were so visionary, but because citizens said, we're going to just keep banging down on your doors until you figure out how to help us do what we think is needed. And if we think we need to work with city planners and others to do it, you make sure they come to the table too. And if we need the scientists and we need the data people, you make sure they come to the table too. Because we can't do it unless you, those who have authority, use your convening power to make this emerge as a movement and a network that is vibrant. Not as vibrant as it could be, and I go into that a lot in the concluding section. And the last thing I will say, and then this will lead directly into what Carolyne and Martha are also doing in their work, is what I try to do in the last part of the book, and that's the final table there, is to say, from what we know not only of the EPA but of several other federal agencies, what could we imagine them doing to build a true civic mission of empowering citizens and communities and helping them embody these various principles to greater and lesser degree? What could we imagine them doing going forward? In other words, what would be a true civic reformation strategy of national public administration, also state and local? How would we reform the progressive era? How would we reform certain aspects of the New Deal and the administrative state that has come into being? Not to throw out the baby with the bathwater, but to truly add elements of civic problem solving, empowered communities, et cetera, into that very model. And what I do there is elaborate what might happen at the federal level. And when Martha and Carolyne finish, and they're going to, I think, certainly I hope they will elaborate on some of what they've been doing in this area, I will put up this final chart to kind of say, well, where does this all fit given all the other stuff that needs to be done to revitalize democracy, electoral reform, community organizing of various sorts, organizing for America, this sort of new phenomena generated out of the Obama campaign, et cetera. Where does this fit in with all of that work? And I'll leave that open for now since I talked too long, so it's good.
I have to admit that I was really thrilled when I was asked to do this because when Carmen's book came out, and I've been reading Carmen's books for years, and I know his work pretty well. When I still remember the Saturday I started reading this one, the Saturday morning, and I got through the first 30 pages, and I thought, I'm glad it's Saturday and I can keep reading. So that's a great endorsement, especially on something that is really looking at case studies and is really just thick and rich with things. But one of the things that I wanted to emphasize a little bit in my respondent role is that one of the things that I think touched me most about Carmen's book is the implicit argument that goes throughout it, sometimes explicit, which is that we have to all look to ourselves to say, do we commit ourselves to making our democracy work better? And that is as an individual commitment and as a collective commitment. And so for me, that was one of the most powerful things. And also the implicit and also explicit argument in the title, which is really that it's time to invest in democracy. That is worth investing in, and I would say from the standpoint of the work we've been doing at Everyday Democracy and our colleagues in the field and our community partners, we certainly see that the time for investment is there. The problems are there, but so are the know-how, the practitioners on the civic side and on the government side. I believe there's a critical mass. You know, we're not falling all over them, but they're there. The lessons are there, the tools are there, the approaches that Carmen described, the principles that can be adapted, and now we see that some national leadership is here. And so I think that's why this is such a time of hope, but it's also, we realize, a time of hard work where there's lots to do. And as Carmen said, the outcome is not a certain one, but we do see this as a window of opportunity for making our democracy work better. And in terms of digging down a little bit, I just wanted to leave you today with a couple of observations from what we've been seeing in our work as we've been working with hundreds of communities for the almost last 20 years, and our work has certainly changed and evolved as communities have been teaching us things over time. And some of the things that I would want to either add as twists to what Carmen has said or tweaks or questions that we should be thinking about. When I found myself thinking about places for strategic investment in making democracy work better, I found myself going back to many of the communities that we've worked with over the years, and I see where people are getting traction. I see where people and institutions are getting traction, and that is they're figuring out how to build multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-sector coalitions. They're figuring out how to engage all sorts of people and bring them to the table for deliberation and dialogue. They're figuring out how to link dialogue and deliberation to problem solving and to collaborative governance. All those things are really happening in rich ways in many places around the country, and in part of what Carmen documents. One of the things that we have seen communities struggle with, and this is where I'd like to put a question to Carmen and to Carolyne and to all of you, is to look at the communities that are doing such rich work who are often struggling with how to connect their collaborative problem solving, their co-production, their collaborative governance to regional, state, and national levels of governance and policy making. And I see that as a really critical element in terms of building this movement for a stronger democracy, because it's something that will help all the pieces go together. And I know from the work that Carolyne and others have done, some of the work we're doing with America Speaks, and listening to some of the champions of participation within federal agencies like Carmen has spoken of, that there is this great interest and movement within agencies to work with communities, and there's a great urgency on behalf of communities. But I think there's a lot of innovation to do here at the middle level in terms of figuring out how do those pieces go together. And it's one where I think the foundation of the building has been built pretty well, but we're going to have to start building different levels of the building simultaneously. And I think that's the building of a stronger democracy. So I think there's a lot of work to be done in that area of innovation. And the second place I wanted to take us today was really going more deeply in a point that Carmen makes in the book that he didn't talk about so much today because it's really part of the setup to, in the argument of his book about what is it really going to take and cost us in order to invest in democracy, and just being aware of what it will take. And one of his points is that we're going to have to take into account how to deal with the growing diversity that is happening in our country. And I would like to second that point, but I'd also like to take it a bit further today. Because one of the things that we've been seeing in our work that's really popping up all over the place, and yet it is often unnamed, are persistent inequalities in all quality of life indicators across the board, whether it be education, health, public safety, anything you look at in terms of economic security. Those quality of life indicators, the inequalities, are strongly correlated with income, yes, and with socioeconomic status, yes. But also, and often unnamed, is that those inequalities are very strongly correlated with racial and ethnic backgrounds regardless of income. And so it's very important for us, I think, to look at this straight on and to say, what does this mean for us as a movement that is creating a stronger democracy? Demos is working on this issue and just came out with a report that you'll see on their website that really documents how 88% of Latino middle-class families and 84% of African-American middle-class families right now are in danger of financial insecurity. And so these are very large numbers that we have to pay attention to. And I'd also mention the links between this and civic participation. Circle recently released a report that links these persistent inequities to inequalities in civic opportunities. This report documented the ways in which especially racial and ethnic and also socioeconomic inequalities in education are linked to high schoolers not receiving the civic engagement opportunities that other high schoolers receive, which is exactly linked to later voting. Not perfectly, but very strongly correlated. So about half of our young people graduate from college. About half of our young people vote. And so when we look at indicators of civic participation, we have to look at these structural inequalities that may not be happening because of any intention at this moment, but whose seeds were planted in prior public policies and institutional practices. And so what I would add here is that I think we need to add something here that says that the movement to strengthen democracy must learn from movements to address racial equity and movements for social inclusion. And if we're going to tackle the persistent inequities as we strategically invest in democracy and as we tackle some of the toughest issues that we face. And lastly, I will end my respondent role by asking my now favorite civic riddle, which is, what do you get when you cross a community organizer with President of the United States? And that is, you get hope for taking our democracy to the next stage. And you get openings for collaborative governance and deliberative democracy. But I'd have to say they are only openings. They're only as good as we will make them, because just like in shared governance, we have some shared democracy building to do. And speaking of that, I'll give you one to-do list to take away from this forum, and that is to go to the White House website, because until Thursday afternoon, we have an opportunity to go on to whitehouse.gov/open and to look at the ideas that people have been sharing about how to flesh out the open government directive. And it's our responsibility, all of us, to go onto that site, to add our ideas, and to vote on the ones that are there. So thanks very much.
Honored to be here, delighted that Demos is, and want to add my wholehearted and sincere congratulations to Carmen on a really terrific book. And I think it's only fair to say, how many published authors are there in the audience? Well, wouldn't you all like to have been as prescient as Carmen was about the timing of his book? I think it's on page 38. He describes, if we finally get, my edit there, if we get leadership that recognizes the importance of reinvesting in democracy, the importance of the role that government has played, we do, as Martha said, have an extraordinary foundation on which to build. And Carmen, in his recommendations, did suggest a White House Office of Collaborative Governance. Many other people were suggesting different names, and now we in fact have a White House that has, I think last I counted, no less than 10 people in the White House itself who have someplace in their title have something about civic participation, collaborative governance. Now, any of you who've ever worked in large bureaucracies, either public or private, know that that's both extraordinarily a plus to bring that kind of commitment directly into the president's inner circles, and also have a little fear and trembling around, if this isn't coordinated and organized, ooh, this could be touchy. I want to, interestingly enough, and we didn't really talk before this panel, but I essentially am going to start exactly where Martha did. I think this moment, frankly, is the most important moment in my lifetime in terms of the possibilities of this country taking another giant step toward pulling together our aspirational democracy and our actual democracy. Carmen does a great job in the book in linking to other historical periods in American history where we had that moment. It's in front of us again. And I think something that is a danger point, since we have such an extraordinarily articulate, values-based, deep understanding of the philosophy of government and democracy as is in President Barack Obama, we have a great danger of us people settling back to wait to see what he and his government do on this issue. And I would say this is a time, wherever you sit, whatever you care about in this country, in your neighborhood, in your community, in your state, and on the national level, now is a time to step up and be proactive about your own vision and our collective vision of the kind of democracy and the kind of country we want to be. If we sit back and wait for the Obama administration to do it, somebody put a quantifiable number on it. Certainly 50% of the potential of this moment will definitely be lost. And my guess is more than that. I want to acknowledge the government's role in this extraordinary moment, and to me that's one of the gifts of Carmen's book, is a real focus on what the government needs to do to seize this moment. You each would have your own way of articulating the past decades of more deeply embedding the gap of trust and cynicism between government and the public. One of the ways that I think we've been on a wake-up call, and Carmen nails it, we've just spent 30-plus years in most of our public forums criticizing the government and focusing on citizens mainly as customers/clients. We are living at a time where most Americans carry a very narrow definition of citizen in their mind and in their behavior. We've seen an explosion and a shift of that in the 2008 election. But the critical relationship, and Carmen says it beautifully, if in fact America is to sustain itself as a self-governing republic, the first and foremost relationship between the government and its citizens is that of citizens. I'm going to put it in the context, America Speaks as Global Voices does a lot of work in particularly Europe. We have so much hubris about our democracy in this country. We really need to face up to the fact that institutionally, we are quite far behind many other governments, the emerging democracies, both in Eastern Europe and Southern Slavic states, European Commission, European Union. Margaret Wellstrom, who came in as the #2 person in the European Commission 2 years ago, when she started her job, had a line item funded at 100 million euros, which at that time was $150 million, today would be almost $200 million. And her job relative to those dollars was to invest in e-governance experiments, to do exactly what Carmen is talking about. How do we collaborate with the public to bring the public's voice into governance? The US has done massive investment in information technology in the last 20 years, but if you go on all government websites, it is always called e-government. So now you can buy your dog tag online, you can do any service that you need from the government in the US online. But there are very few examples of e-governance in the US. We've got a huge gap to pick up in the investment on the decision-making side. Carmen's example about EPA. I'm going to share one example. I served as chief of staff to the governor of Ohio in the late 80s. We learned the same lesson that Carmen writes in his book about EPA. It is the intricate relationship between a nascent citizen movement and the government using grants and capacity building to support those movements to end up with a truly collaborative relationship between a vibrant government and a vibrant community. He talked about it as the Watershed Movement. In Ohio, we did it in the mental health services and systems. We did it in economic development for middle-sized businesses, where you take small amounts of government dollars and invest it again in the general interest public who knows they have to make a difference on a key issue. Technology is the second thing I want to talk about. And although actually Carmen didn't go deeply into that in the book, he gives us the quote that we all should care about as early as page 7. We will not automatically be rescued by technology in terms of the deficits in our democracy. Rather, we will have to design and use technology to support democratic collaborative governance. I came up on the train this morning. The New York Times editorializes on the Obama Open Government Directive. I would say that for many of us who've been working in these fields heartily for 20, 30, whatever number of decades, our biggest concern today about the Open Government Directive is that both the government itself and the media will focus 80% of its time on transparency and government data and 20% of its time on participation and collaboration. This is another way you can help. There's no question that people in the Obama team want to hear from people. But let me just read one sentence out of data.gov. It is no surprise that the IT candidate, Barack Obama, is intent on being the IT president. Okay, that's going to go down in history as the New York Times and many other media. He is our IT candidate and our IT president. Narrative is hugely important as public good and public space. That, I submit, is the wrong narrative, both about President Obama's campaign and about his presidency in terms of what he himself says. The reason the Obama campaign caught fire like it did was he was perceptive enough to see the activism that was already out there. He didn't create it, he joined it, and then used an extraordinarily sophisticated link between IT and community organizing to do what the web does best in terms of sending out information, broadcasting it to tens of thousands of people, but then what the human interface does best. So it's the person who knocked on your door asking you to vote that you trust that made the difference in voter turnout. It was not the sophisticated, it was the combination. I don't want to overstate it. But those of us who care deeply about this will have to be vigilant as we move forward. On the next page, there is a terrific Bob Herbert column on our Crumbling Foundation. I want to go right back to Martha's statement about if we're really reinvesting in our government, we've got to look at these deep divides that exist in our culture relative to access, to equity, to income, etc. So what we need to quickly do is take the great capacity that's there in IT and the human interface and start linking it to this topic, crumbling infrastructure. Herbert, in about 50 or 60 words, describes who's lost all the jobs that we've lost since December 2007. They are exactly the people in Demos's report and Martha's remarks. We need to start linking the experiments in transparency, participation, and collaboration to these real-time issues. We don't have to wait around for Obama to do this on the national stage. It'd be great if he did quickly, but you live someplace. You live someplace where you know exactly what the rate of unemployment for young African-American men is. Take that sample and bring those two issues together as quickly as we can. One last thing. Again, Carmen stepped out in the closing chapter in a beautiful way around the key things that federal policy to support collaborative governance. He already talked about the White House Governance Office. Then he talked about the civic mission of federal agencies and the expansion and alignment of national service. Both Carmen and Martha acknowledged some work done by federal managers called champions of participation, both program people embedded deep in the bureaucracy and SESers and political appointees. Here's a sobering reminder of why we have to stay vigilant. America Speaks first convened these kinds of champions of participation in 2005. And as about 35 or 40 federal, Carmen was there, as they gathered, imagine our surprise when Jerry Priscoli, thank you, from the Army Corps of Engineers, another agency besides EPA that in part has this marbled into how they work, stood and addressed us and said that he was given as an IPA, otherwise given as staff, to the White House Office of Citizen Participation that was created under President Jimmy Carter. None of us in the room had ever even heard about it. So that happened in 1976, not as well publicized, not as well marbled in, but that was another moment when there was a link between leaders and what has to happen next in democracy. So I'm just going to give you, and I hope that Carmen quickly gets to write his chapter 6 over again in whatever form he wants to push the window further. And here's what some federal managers say it should be pushed. Number one, connect these efforts of the administration to an already existing federal structure that marbles it totally into the government. And the one they universally picked is called the President's Management Council. The reports directly to Jeff Zients, who is the M in OMB, so it is perfect in terms of institutionalization. Number two, establish senior-level champions and put it into strategic plans and policy statements. So build on what Carmen says about the civic mission of the agency, but don't stop at the mission statement. Marble it into the systems that drive how resources are allocated and how the federal government evaluates federal employees. And a key recognition that Martha's organization has worked for decades on, our organization works on, all of the people in the deliberative democracy space. There has to be a tremendous amount of capacity building and training done, both for federal managers who do not necessarily know how to do this work well, and for the public, who has been out of practice of it for decades and who's mostly been pushed into public spaces that take us to our lowest common denominator, or as Lincoln would say and Obama picked up in the campaign, takes us to our baser instincts rather than to our better angels. My closing was going to be exactly Martha's again, which is, here is something you can practically do. This website, whitehouse.gov, go to opengovernment/gov, I guess it is. Until Thursday, there are recommendations about what should be, for the first time ever, a presidential task force is engaging the public at the stage of drafting the recommendations. It has 3 phases. First 2 weeks are brainstorming, second 2 weeks are discussion, and the third week is to actually create a collaborative workspace online to deal with the draft recommendations. At this point in time, I checked this morning on the train, only 19,000 people have voted. Now, I can guarantee you one thing from the American public: government reform is not the highest thing on their agenda. If they put up a web space in which they link infrastructure investment with these issues, they'll get a lot more than 19,000 votes. But in the meantime, Beth Novak, who's running this, is totally sincere about wanting people's input before the recommendations go to the president. So sign on and join up. Thank you. The most important skill that we need to bring back individually and collectively to get beyond the kind of mass media description of what's our next version going to be is imagination. It's how do you put individuals and small groups of people together, in rooms together, over time, imagining what the new economy looks like, imagining what the new banking regulation system looks like, imagining what the alternative energy pieces are. And I'm dead serious when I say it. I don't know about you, but I can every day get up every morning and I can look at enough data to feel like there's very little hope that we're going to make it across this chasm. Or I can look at data that is the sprinkles of inspiration about, yes, we can. And I think every single one of us has more of a responsibility, I'll say, than ever before in my lifetime, is to choose where to put positive energy in what you think you can do. And I've gone so far as to say, usually not in a webcast, but that on a given day, if I can't figure out a place to put in that positive energy, then I should take a day off. Because me walking around moaning and groaning about how difficult this is going to be and how impossible this is going to be is part of the problem, not part of the solution.
We can't solve these tough problems well or sustainably without getting more democratic. It's not a luxury. It's not something at the edges. It's really connected to how we're going to solve the problems. And I think that has to be part of the narrative.